When a soldier marched into battle, what truly kept him alive? Was it his rifle, his courage, or a crust of bread hidden in his pocket? Imagine an American GI choking down powdered eggs that tasted like dust, a Japanese conscript gnawing on grass and bark to quiet his stomach, or a German infantryman at Stalingrad boiling strips of leather because there was nothing else left. These were not just meals. They were battles fought in silence against an enemy far more relentless than bullets or bombs: hunger. And in World War II, hunger was often the sharpest weapon of all. This is not the story of generals moving armies on maps or of tanks and airplanes that roared across Europe and the Pacific. This is the story of men, ordinary soldiers, who discovered that survival sometimes depended less on courage and more on whatever could be found in a mess tin. Stay with us, because what soldiers ate in World War II is darker, stranger, and more revealing than you have ever imagined. The war that erupted in September of 1939 did not only pit nations against each other. It tested every human being caught in its path. Behind the clash of weapons stood a quieter struggle, the desperate attempt to feed millions of men scattered across continents. No matter how advanced the armies, no matter how vast the empires, every soldier was chained to his stomach. An empty belly could weaken the strongest fighter, crack morale, and even bring entire campaigns to ruin. The United States built the most advanced logistical system in history. Trains, ships, and trucks moved mountains of supplies across oceans and battlefields. Yet, for the soldier crouched in a foxhole in France or slogging through the jungles of the Pacific, rations often meant monotony and hunger. The British soldier, meanwhile, clung to his cup of tea as if it were sacred, a lifeline in the mud and the sand. German troops, who once prided themselves on hearty bread and sausage, found their meals reduced to ersatz substitutes, bread mixed with sawdust, coffee made of roasted barley. Soviet soldiers, retreating across their vast homeland, dreamed of bread more than of victory. And Japanese soldiers, bound by a code of endurance, starved on remote islands until their bodies wasted away. It was not only the fighting men. Civilians at home, prisoners in camps, and even children in cities under siege endured hunger that was as destructive as gunfire. Food became currency, it became hope, it became despair. And its absence shaped the war in ways often forgotten today. This story is not about recipes or field kitchens. It is about survival. It is about how armies that seemed unstoppable could collapse when their soldiers had nothing left to eat. And it is about how, in World War II, every scrap of bread, every spoonful of soup, every can of Spam was as important as any bullet fired in anger. For the average American soldier in World War II, food was both a source of pride and a constant frustration. The United States Army created three main rations designed to fuel the fighting man: the K ration, the C ration, and the B ration. Each was intended for a different purpose, each carefully calculated to meet the needs of men in combat. Yet when those boxes reached the front, reality told a harsher story. The K ration was a small box designed to provide one day's worth of meals. Inside, soldiers found biscuits, a small tin of cheese spread, canned meat, instant coffee, powdered drink tablets, and sometimes a piece of chewing gum. At first, men marveled at the compact design. Everything they needed fit neatly into a box that could be slipped into a pocket. But the wonder soon gave way to disappointment. The K ration provided barely 3,000 calories, just enough for a man sitting still, but far too little for a soldier burning twice that amount in combat. After weeks on the march, men lost weight, grew weak, and joked bitterly that the K stood not for Kellogg or Complete, but for killer. Letters sent home reveal how soldiers saw their meals not as sustenance, but as punishment. One American infantryman fighting in Italy wrote to his family, "We've eaten so many C-rations, I cannot tell if I am fighting the Germans or the meat in the can." The C-ration, meant to provide hot meals in the field, came in heavy tins of stew, beans, or Spam. Soldiers often carried them for weeks, eating them cold with bayonets because lighting fires risked enemy detection. The taste, many said, was like grease mixed with cardboard. Yet those same men also admitted that when a rare hot breakfast with real eggs or a slice of pie came from a field kitchen, morale soared. A hot meal could lift spirits more than a fresh shipment of ammunition. As the war dragged on, supply lines grew strained. During long pushes across France, many American units lived for days on nothing but C-rations. They bartered with French civilians, traded with British soldiers, and scavenged from abandoned farms. Chickens, potatoes, and wine disappeared quickly wherever American troops marched. The irony was unmistakable. The United States had the most powerful supply system in history, yet the men at the front often lived on monotony and hunger. What food could not provide in flavor, it sometimes offered in ritual. Soldiers invented games to pass the time, trying to trade cans of meat for chocolate bars or cigarettes. They mixed instant coffee, sugar, and powdered milk from different ration boxes to create makeshift battlefield lattes. They chewed the same sticks of gum over and over, more for comfort than for taste. Food became less about nutrition and more about survival of the spirit. If American soldiers measured their war by Spam and instant coffee, British soldiers measured theirs by tea. From the deserts of North Africa to the fields of Normandy, tea was more than a drink. It was a lifeline. Each British soldier carried a small ration of black tea, sugar, and powdered milk. No matter the conditions, no matter the danger, men went to extraordinary lengths to brew a cup. One officer admitted, "We would risk a sniper's bullet for a proper cup of tea. Without it, the war would have been lost." Beyond tea, however, British rations were notoriously grim. The daily issue often included tinned bully beef, a salty corned beef paste, hard biscuits that could chip teeth, and canned vegetables. Soldiers quickly learned to improvise. Some mixed bully beef with biscuit crumbs to create a kind of hash. Others traded with American troops for chocolate or cigarettes. Still, many complained that their meals were more punishment than nourishment. Letters home paint a bleak picture. "We have bully beef for breakfast, bully beef for dinner, and bully beef for tea. If I see another cow, I'll shoot it out of spite." In North Africa, where supply lines stretched thin, many units lived for weeks on little more than tea, bully beef, and jam. When fresh supplies finally arrived, the relief was palpable. A single slice of fresh bread or an apple could bring men nearly to tears. Field kitchens sometimes offered stews, but they were watery, bland, and filled with whatever scraps could be found. Soldiers joked that their cooks were magicians, not because they created fine meals, but because they could make food disappear into thin broth. What distinguished the British experience was not only the monotony of the rations, but also the knowledge that their families at home were suffering the same. Civilian rationing in Britain was strict. Families lived on powdered eggs, bread stretched with potato flour, and meager portions of meat. Soldiers in the field often felt guilty when they received luxuries like canned fruit, knowing that their children back home had not seen such things in years. That shared hardship created a sense of grim solidarity. The soldier's suffering was not his alone. It was the burden of a nation. And yet, despite the complaints, the monotony of British rations carried its own strange strength. The tea ration, however small, became sacred. It was a daily ritual that reminded men of home, of order, and of a world beyond the battlefield. In the end, tea and bully beef may have been tasteless, but they hardened British resolve. Thus, in both American and British armies, food was not simply calories. It was pride when the system worked, punishment when it failed, and a measure of how much the human spirit could endure. In the early years of the war, German soldiers carried rations that seemed to reflect their nation's pride in discipline and efficiency. Rye bread, sausages, cheese, and canned meat filled their packs. They even carried iron rations, emergency supplies of hard bread, chocolate, and tinned meat, reserved for desperate moments. At first, many German troops believed they were better fed than their enemies. But as the war stretched into the east, those comforts disappeared. Supply lines grew fragile across the vast Russian front. By the winter of 1941, German soldiers depended increasingly on ersatz foods, substitutes that offered little more than disappointment. Bread was stretched with sawdust or ground turnips. Coffee became bitter powder made from roasted barley or chicory. Sausages, once a source of national pride, were bulked out with fillers until they resembled little more than flavorless paste. A soldier in Stalingrad wrote bitterly, Our bread is so black and dense we cannot tell if it is food or coal. Desperation seeped into every letter home. Soldiers begged families for butter, real coffee, or chocolate. Yet by 1943, even civilians back in Germany struggled to find meat or fat. When care packages arrived, they became lifelines. But often there was nothing to send. On the front, soldiers turned to scavenging. They looted Soviet villages for potatoes, slaughtered livestock, and stripped abandoned Red Army supplies. Some even stole from their allies, Italians and Romanians, who were already starving. At Stalingrad, the nightmare reached its peak. When rations collapsed completely, men ate their horses. They boiled leather straps, and in the shadows, whispers told of darker acts. Hunger stripped away discipline, honor, even humanity. The once proud Wehrmacht learned that starvation could destroy an army faster than Soviet bullets. For Soviet soldiers, hunger was not just a condition of war, it was a weapon deliberately wielded against them. The Red Army's ration system promised bread, porridge, cabbage soup, and sometimes meat. In reality, men often received little more than a crust of black bread and a bowl of watery soup. By the summer of 1941, as German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, chaos and retreat shattered supply lines. Entire divisions went hungry for days at a time. The standard ration was kasha, a porridge of buckwheat or millet, alongside thin cabbage soup called shai. When lucky, men received a slice of salted pork fat, which they rubbed against bread to give it flavor. Meat was rare, sugar was almost unheard of. Tea was little more than hot water poured over the same few leaves again and again. Vodka rations sometimes appeared, not to nourish but to steel men's nerves before an assault. Letters from the front speak with haunting honesty. One soldier during the siege of Leningrad wrote, "We dream only of bread. Even bullets do not frighten us like hunger does." At Stalingrad, the nightmare deepened. Soldiers consumed as little as 1,200 calories a day, barely half of what was needed to survive in combat. They boiled belts and boots. They chewed bark. They trapped stray dogs. They hunted rats. Anything that could be swallowed became food. And yet, in that misery, a strange form of solidarity emerged. Soldiers divided rations with mathematical precision, ensuring that every crumb was shared. A single slice of bread could become a symbol of loyalty, of unity, of defiance. Hunger broke bodies, but it also forged bonds that nothing else could. Still, the suffering was immense. Desertions rose in starving units. Morale cracked. German armies used starvation deliberately, cutting supply lines, besieging cities, and waiting for hunger to do what bullets could not. If American soldiers complained of monotony and British soldiers endured bully beef, Japanese soldiers faced starvation as a way of life. Their army was built on the principle of gaman, to endure hardship without complaint. Their rations reflected this harsh philosophy. A typical pack included rice, pickled vegetables, dried fish, and sometimes miso soup. On paper, it was simple but nourishing. In practice, it was rarely delivered. Japan's empire stretched across distant islands in the Pacific, where supply lines snapped under the pressure of Allied naval power. On isolated outposts, soldiers survived on little more than rice, coconuts, and whatever could be foraged. Meat was virtually non-existent. Vegetables rotted before reaching the front. Men grew gaunt, their bodies wasting away. One Japanese diary from Iwo Jima reads, "We have eaten all the dogs, the rats, even the weeds. Still we fight. Diseases like beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency, spread rapidly. Men collapsed not from bullets, but from hunger." Yet the culture of endurance made matters worse. Complaining was forbidden. Hunger was treated as a test of loyalty. Soldiers who scavenged or begged risked punishment. They were ordered to suffer silently. The result was horrifying. Some units resorted to cannibalism. On several Pacific islands, desperate soldiers ate enemy corpses, and in some cases, even their own dead. These acts, though whispered, were real. They were the darkest consequence of a system that valued obedience over survival. American Marines were shocked by the skeletal defenders they encountered, men so weak they could barely hold rifles, yet still refusing to surrender. Hunger did not break their will to fight. It stripped them down to nothing but will itself. Japan's planners believed their soldiers could survive on half the calories of Western troops. They assumed hunger would harden them, make them leaner, tougher, more obedient. Instead, it killed them in staggering numbers. Hunger was not just a condition of their war, it was the war. Thus, in Germany, in the Soviet Union, and in Japan, hunger became more than a hardship. It became a weapon, used deliberately by leaders, by enemies, by the war itself. And in that weapon, millions of soldiers discovered that sometimes the deadliest enemy was not across the battlefield, but inside their own empty stomachs. If rations for soldiers at the front were harsh, those for prisoners of war were catastrophic. Captured soldiers discovered that hunger itself became a form of torture. In German prisoner of war camps, Allied captives were issued a thin slice of black bread, a ladle of watery soup, and perhaps a spoonful of margarine. These rations were not enough to sustain life for long. What saved many were Red Cross parcels, which included chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat, and powdered milk. A single parcel could mean the difference between survival and collapse. But the parcels did not always arrive. Delays, theft, or deliberate withholding by camp guards meant that many prisoners slowly wasted away. Even with the aid, the toll was terrible. Some men lost half their body weight. They wrote home of gnawing hunger that never left them, of nights spent dreaming of food more vividly than of family. One British prisoner wrote, "We became less than men. We thought only of food." In Japanese camps, conditions were even darker. Prisoners received a handful of rice and little else. Dysentery and scurvy spread rapidly. Survivors remembered scraping maggots from rice, fighting over scraps, or risking savage beatings to steal food. The cruelty was not always in the portion, but in the deliberate denial. Guards withheld meals as punishment, knowing hunger could break even the strongest man faster than a beating. For countless men, starvation was a slow execution. But it was Soviet prisoners who endured the worst fate of all. Captured in their millions by German forces, they were deliberately starved to death. The Nazi regime considered them unworthy of life. Rations were cut so low they could not sustain survival. Within months, bodies lay piled outside camps. Historians estimate more than 2 million Soviet prisoners of war died from hunger and neglect. A silent massacre carried out not with guns but with empty bowls. For these men, food became obsession. They scribbled recipes in their diaries, fantasized about feasts, and created entire imaginary banquets in whispered conversations. Hunger was not only physical torment, but psychological warfare. It stripped men of dignity, reduced them to creatures who thought of nothing but bread. And yet, even in the darkest camps, acts of humanity appeared. Prisoners shared crumbs, split cigarettes, or gave away what little they had to keep a comrade alive another day. Where official rations failed, the black market thrived. Across Europe and Asia, soldiers, civilians, and even officers learned to bend the rules. Survival often depended not on what the army provided, but on what could be found, traded, or stolen. In occupied France, both Allied and German troops bartered with local farmers. Cigarettes, chocolate, and soap became currency, exchanged for eggs, butter, or chicken. A single can of American Spam could be traded for a meal big enough to feed a family. Soldiers smuggled supplies from depots, sometimes at great risk, to gain luxuries the ration system never allowed. German soldiers, facing shortages by the later years of the war, leaned heavily on such underground trade. They sneaked bread from bakeries, looted abandoned farms, or struck deals with civilians. British troops, tired of endless tins of bully beef, became inventive. They fashioned makeshift ovens from ammunition boxes to bake crude bread. Americans mixed powdered milk, sugar, and instant coffee into improvised battlefield lattes. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops fried potato peelings over candles, turning scraps into a rare treat. Even in the jungles of the Pacific, Japanese soldiers tried to innovate. They cooked rice inside bamboo tubes or mixed grass with whatever rations they had left. But often, desperation pushed men from ingenuity to theft. Civilians across occupied territories found their food seized by hungry soldiers. Villages were stripped bare, and resentment festered. To the local people, soldiers were not only liberators or conquerors, they were mouths to feed. sometimes at the expense of starving families. The black market revealed the darker side of hunger. Survival blurred the line between necessity and crime. Letters from soldiers mention raiding chicken coops as casually as recounting a firefight. Food, once sacred, became another resource to seize, another weapon in the war of endurance. By the end of the conflict, the black market had grown into a vast shadow economy. In many places, it shaped post-war recovery as much as official policy. Families survived not because of ration cards, but because of cigarettes, chocolate, or cans passed hand to hand in secret. And when the war ended, the memory of hunger did not fade. It lived on in the habits of those who survived. Veterans returned home with strange rituals. Some hoarded bread in cupboards. Others refused to throw away even the smallest scrap. Families noticed how fathers demanded that plates be cleaned completely, as though leaving food was an unforgivable sin. Survivors of prison camps often developed compulsive eating, unable to resist stockpiling whenever food was available. The trauma of hunger lasted longer than wounds from bullets. But food also left a legacy of culture. In America, canned Spam became not only a wartime staple, but a post-war phenomenon. It spread across the Pacific, embraced in Hawaii, the Philippines, and South Korea, where it remains beloved. Instant coffee, once a soldier's lifeline, became a household standard. In Britain, rationing continued long after 1945, shaping recipes that survive to this day, dishes built on creativity with limited ingredients. In Germany and the Soviet Union, bread was elevated almost to the level of sacred symbol, families retelling stories of how crumbs had once meant life or death. In Japan, the memory was most haunting. Survivors spoke quietly of eating bark, grass, and worse. The culture of silent endurance, gaman, persisted long after the war. And in the years of recovery, food abundance became not just comfort but redemption. Rice, once scarce, rose as a symbol of national pride. The legacy of hunger in World War II was written not only in stomachs but in hearts. It shaped cultures, altered families, and left invisible scars. Every can of Spam, every crust of bread, every scrap of meat carried memories of despair, survival, and resilience. Hunger outlasted the battlefield. It became the ghost at every table, the shadow that lingered over a generation. When we speak of hunger in war, we are not simply talking about empty stomachs. We are speaking of fear, of despair, of the collapse of the human spirit when the body is starved beyond endurance. Hunger was not an accident of circumstance in World War II. It was a strategy, a weapon, and sometimes the silent executioner. The German army believed that by cutting Soviet supply lines, entire cities could be brought to their knees without firing a shell. At Leningrad, this strategy killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, turning hunger into a weapon more brutal than bombs. The Japanese military planners believed that their soldiers could live on half the calories of their Western counterparts. That decision condemned countless young men to die not by bullets, but by starvation. And in the prison camps of Germany and Japan, starvation was used with cold calculation, a slow method of breaking men without lifting a rifle. For the survivors, hunger became a ghost that followed them home. A man who had starved in a prisoner camp never again looked at a loaf of bread in the same way. Many could not bear to waste food. They scraped plates clean, hoarded crumbs, and stored food in cupboards even when abundance returned. Some could not stop eating, devouring food compulsively as if to fight off the memory of emptiness. Wives and children often misunderstood, not realizing that these strange habits were the shadows of war. Families inherited the trauma. Children grew up with fathers who demanded discipline at the dinner table, who refused to see food wasted, who lectured on the value of bread as if it were sacred. To those veterans, bread was not just food, it was survival, it was life itself. For Soviet families, bread became almost holy. Stories of wartime hunger were told around kitchen tables for decades, passed on as warnings, as lessons, as memories too painful to forget. The cultural impact was vast. In the United States, Spam, once mocked as mystery meat, became beloved across the Pacific. In Hawaii, in the Philippines, in South Korea, Spam was transformed into a delicacy, a reminder of both hardship and resilience. Instant coffee, born in foxholes and ration kits, became a morning ritual in millions of American homes. In Britain, years of rationing gave birth to dishes of resourcefulness, simple pies, stews, and puddings crafted from scraps that shaped national cuisine long after the war. In Germany, the memory of ersatz food became a symbol of humiliation. The black bread filled with sawdust, the bitter coffee made of barley, reminded people of how far their nation had fallen. In Japan, the memory of hunger was even darker. Survivors spoke quietly, if at all, of eating bark, grass, and even human flesh. The silence itself became part of the culture, an endurance, a refusal to speak, a deep scar beneath the surface of national pride. And yet, the story of food in World War II is not only a story of horror, it is also a story of humanity's capacity for resilience. Soldiers shared rations when they had nothing. Prisoners split crumbs with dying comrades. Civilians risked their lives to smuggle food to neighbors. In the darkest hunger, people still found ways to affirm life. Perhaps that is why food became so deeply symbolic after the war. A family meal was no longer just a meal. It was a triumph. It was proof that the war had ended, that children would not go hungry again. Bread, rice, Spam, coffee, these were no longer just foods. They were reminders of survival, of endurance, of the price paid for peace. But the legacy of hunger carries a warning too. It teaches us that starvation is not a natural disaster. It is a choice, often imposed by those in power. In World War II, hunger was inflicted deliberately, by blockades, by policies, by cruel neglect. It was weaponized against soldiers, against prisoners, against civilians. And if history teaches us anything, it is that hunger can be wielded again. That is why remembering the hunger of World War II is not only about honoring the past, it is about protecting the future. It is about asking what kind of world we want to leave behind. Do we allow hunger to be used again as a weapon? Or do we fight as those soldiers once did to ensure that no child, no soldier, no prisoner is ever starved again? When veterans spoke of the war, they often stayed silent about hunger. It was too painful, too shameful, too hard to put into words. But their silence does not mean we should forget. On the contrary, it demands that we remember. Because if we forget, we risk repeating the same cruelty. So let us say it clearly. Food in World War II was not just about calories. Food in World War II was about survival and despair. Food in World War II was about humanity stripped bare and humanity enduring all the same. The next time you sit at a table and see bread before you, remember that for millions, that bread once meant the difference between life and death. The next time you open a can, remember the soldiers who lived for months on tins of meat, dreaming of home. And the next time you waste food, remember the men and women who never had enough, whose stomachs growled louder than the guns. If this story moved you, do not keep it silent. Share it, speak it, remember it, because the hunger of World War II still whispers across generations. And it tells us one thing above all. Peace is fragile, survival is precious, and justice must never again allow starvation to be used as a weapon. As the war dragged on, hunger became the thread that tied every battlefield, every camp, and every home together. It was the hidden front line, stretching from the foxholes of Normandy to the prison barracks of Poland, from the rice fields of the Pacific to the frozen villages of Russia. Soldiers marched with rifles in their hands, but it was their stomachs that determined how long they could endure. Civilians tilled their gardens and stood in ration lines, their sacrifices echoing those of the men in uniform. And in every occupied country, the shadow of the black market grew larger, a silent reminder that when official systems collapsed, survival depended on human ingenuity, and sometimes on desperate choices. What makes this story so haunting is not only the physical suffering, but the way hunger reshaped human behavior. Men who once lived honest lives became scavengers, raiders, even thieves. Prisoners, once proud soldiers, were reduced to bargaining for crumbs or licking bowls clean. Civilians learned to stretch flour with potato skins, to fry weeds, to boil leather, to make meals out of things never meant for human mouths. And yet, within this grim reality, there was also resilience. A shared cigarette, a crust of bread divided into equal parts, a cup of weak tea brewed under fire. These became moments of dignity, of solidarity, of hope. Hunger blurred the boundaries between enemy and friend, between soldier and civilian, between right and wrong. An American GI trading spam for eggs with a French farmer, a German soldier stealing from a Soviet barn, a British private risking his life for a cup of tea. Each story reminds us that survival in World War II was measured as much by food as by bullets. It is easy to read about battles and victories, about strategy and maps. But if we truly wish to understand the war, we must look at what men ate, what they dreamed of eating, and what they were forced to endure when nothing was left. By the final years of the conflict, hunger had become universal. No nation, no army, no family escaped its reach. For some, it meant monotony, another tin of bully beef, another spoonful of powdered eggs. For others, it meant starvation, a handful of rice, a crust of black bread, or nothing at all. And for millions, it meant death, not quick on the battlefield, but slow, gnawing, relentless. This is the bridge to the most important truth. The war ended with treaties and surrenders, but the hunger of World War II did not end in 1945. It carried on in the memories of veterans, in the habits of families, and in the cultures of nations. It lived on in cupboards stuffed with bread, in plates that were never left unfinished, recipes born of scarcity that still survive today. Hunger outlasted the war. It became its most enduring legacy, and it is here, at this intersection of memory and survival, that we turn to the final lesson. Because the story of food in World War II is not only about what men endured, it is about what humanity must never allow to happen again.